share with us work that he's working on across the nation. You heard Glenn refer to the work of GENI, which is actually a next generation network. We've been talking all day about networks that are on the immediate horizon. GENI in some ways is really a project that is evolving really in the research in the community first, very much like the internet, as we've known it, started in the research community. Chip Elliott is the project director. Indeed, he's also the PI for GENI. He's based in the Boston area. He's been working in these and other complex networking programs for nearly 30 years, and is in many ways the architect of what might well be the next internet as we know it, or actually as we're going to find out about it. So please join me in welcoming Chip Elliott.
Well, thank you very much, Glenn, and it's really good to be back in Cleveland again. I'm here on behalf of the GENI project, which is sponsored by the National Science Foundation. And I'd like to begin by posing a question to us all, really. What is it like to live in the future? You know, are we all going to be wearing jetpacks 5 years from now or 10 years from now? Are we going to be eating, you know, stuff that's grown in big vats, or the building's going to be plastic? You know, what is it like to live in the future? Well, it's kind of hard to predict. I mean, the world is littered with predictions about what the future is going to be like. And we could spend quite a bit of time here, if we wanted to, talking about what it's like to live in the future. But I have something I really believe, which is that the best way to predict the future is to invent it. Make it yourself. A very wise fellow said this, Alan Kay. And Alan Kay has spent pretty much his lifetime predicting the future, actually inventing the future. He started doing this in the late 60s when he dreamt up this kind of concept that you'd be able to have a computer you could carry around, and you could probably type documents on it or something. Probably you could store all your photos on it, maybe your music. Maybe all the world's encyclopedias would be inside this thing. So this was kind of his idea in 1968, and he started building it. Remember, this is the time, if you're old enough, you remember, there were 3 television channels at this point. The phones were all black and so on. So here's this wild man who has the idea, hey, this is what's going to be, and he started building it. Okay, but that's kind of not the question. The question is, what is it like to live in the future? What's it like? Well, the answer kind of varies depending when you are. So if you're about 1 million BC, that's not the exact date. You know, the future is kind of a sharp stick, and boy, we get to cook and eat our meat now, and it tastes a lot better. So that was kind of the future then. 1830, plus or minus, in my current hometown of Arlington, Massachusetts, the ice technology was extremely high technology. You may not think this, but there was a huge wave of innovation about cutting up ice, transporting it, storing it. Ice from Arlington, Massachusetts, our little pond in Arlington, Massachusetts, was shipped all through the Caribbean. There were storehouses all through the Caribbean. That's where they got their ice from. And in fact, most of British India was supplied by ice out of Massachusetts. This huge web of transporting ice to the tropics, storing it for years, and so forth. In fact, Queen Victoria's ice that she served to all her guests and she used herself always came from a little town just north of Arlington. Okay, let me give a little quiz to us all. During about 1 generation in New Haven, Connecticut, I was reading a book about this, they acquired 5 new technologies: electricity, gas, trolley cars, running water, and telephones. So my quiz to you is, what order, if you're living in New Haven in this time, what order do these things come into your life? So which one is first? Gas. Which one is second? Water. Third? Trolley cars. Fourth and fifth? Electricity, then the phone. Okay, the answer is actually kind of interesting. If you put yourself in that position, you realize, hey, the past was a little bit different than I thought. Gas was first, then the telephone, then trolley cars, electricity followed, and last but not least, running water. Okay, so you can see why the phone companies and the trolleys had their own electrical system. There wasn't an electrical system there. And you think, hey, when people were using electric lights, most of them didn't have running water. A very interesting order that things happened in. Here's another little bit of living in the future. This is a book I love. Jack Kerouac, one of the original beatniks, went to visit Gary Snyder in Berkeley, California, 1958. And this book is basically a transcript of staying there. They went camping together out in the Sierra Nevadas. And Jack Kerouac did it the usual way. He took his car and he loaded the tent in the trunk, right, the army tent that he bought in surplus, with a bunch of shovels and about 2 cases of canned beans, right? So he's ready to go camping. Well, he's going with Gary Snyder, who lives in Berkeley, 1958. Gary doesn't have a car, but he has something Jack Kerouac has never seen before, which is a 10-speed bicycle. One of the few in the U.S. that was imported from Italy. He has a tent, but it's a really weird one. It's made out of nylon, and you can put it on your back and carry it. And the food he brings, tofu. So this whole book is kind of a record of a guy who's living in the present, Jack Kerouac, who just happens to be visiting this guy who's living, I don't know, 10, 15 years in the future, Gary Snyder. Kerouac is just totally floored by this. He's never seen anything like this in his life. And indeed, the future is kind of hard to predict. Right? Who'd have thought that tofu was the future? Okay, my own kind of childhood, and I know Glenn in particular was very active in these days. There were kind of a scruffy band of computer people who were hanging out, doing computer stuff. You know, they were just kind of doing things, trying things, and you remember what computers were like in the old days. Well, somehow that started morphing with this thing called the Arpanet, which was this nationwide research network. Covered the U.S. You can see how many campuses were in the Arpanet in those days. And the computer people and the Arpanet people started to kind of morph into each other. And then perhaps most interestingly, they kind of became the environment in the schools, right? First in the universities and the colleges, then into the high schools, and gradually down. And so you had people in these universities who were using email in their everyday life. They were using laser printers. They created documents on the computer. They started using the web, and so on. Gradually, this started to permeate all our lives, starting in the schools, and kind of became today's mass market culture. Who would have thought it? Well, Alan Kay actually thought of this in 1968, right? And a lot of us in the business really knew about Alan's work, right? It kind of informed what we were thinking about and what we were doing. Another example. NSF, the National Science Foundation, had a digital library project, $4 million over 4 years. They funded 6 colleges. Oh, by the way, one of the outcomes was Google. Well, a lot of other stuff started up in or around the universities as well. And this is pretty much a mainstay of a lot of our economy. GENI, about 2 weeks ago, Nicira, a company that came out of Stanford 3 years ago, an open flow company, was just purchased for $1.25 billion, right? Which is a pretty good price for a 3-year-old company. And that's because people believe it's really worth that. So in the GENI project, we're starting to build out through campuses across the United States this advanced network that will let you do the internet, but things beyond the internet. In particular, GENI has this idea of deep programmability. I think one of the things that made the internet so good was you could put any software you wanted in your computer and run it. That really opened up the space for innovation. The GENI idea is, great, let's do that through the entire network. Why can't you put the software you want in the cloud, in your routers, in your firewalls, everywhere throughout the network? Let's just totally open it up so that people can put any software they want in the network. How are we building this thing? We're convincing commercial manufacturers to make the smallest change that's necessary to their equipment so it can support this vision. Then we're putting this commercial equipment in a bunch of schools, first in the labs, then in the wiring closets, then throughout the dormitories, and using it. And then we lace this all together to form GENI. Georgia Tech is a great example. We work with the researchers there, but we also work with the CIOs very closely. They've taken a bunch of commercial equipment, very early prototypes, tried it in their lab, figured out how to get the IT staff to support it, and so forth. Now they're building it out through the classroom buildings and their dormitories. So that's the trajectory. So let me ask you, what is it like to live in the future? Well, I have a very kind of pragmatic American answer. Let's find out. Let's invent it. Let's do it ourselves. We aim to have GENI expand to 100 to 200 campuses across the U.S. We've got a lot of the very brightest young researchers involved in building this and helping make this happen. And in fact, it's happening right here. Case Western, Lev, is playing kind of a key role in getting this whole thing together and making it happen. It's open to all the universities in the U.S. If you're interested, I encourage you, get in touch with Lev or Gracie, who's here from Youngstown, and let's make it happen together.